Hello, welcome. I'm Madeline Craig. I'm an educator and a life coach for families struggling with a loved one's drug or alcohol abuse. And this is another episode of my video blog, which I call Hope for Families TV. I call this Hope for Families TV because I intend for all of my work to offer you hope in what I know can be a very dark situation. And this is episode 3 of my Why I Do What I Do series. So let's take a look at reason number 3. Have you ever been told that your loved one just needs to hit rock bottom before they'll ever change? Well, that is categorically untrue and is in fact a very dangerous myth that still circulates in society. And that leads me to the third reason I do what I do. Reason number 3 that I do what I do is because so many of the cultural myths about addiction, about family addiction, often referred to as codependency, although codependency does occur in many other contexts, those myths are hindering our ability to effectively address the epidemic of addiction and its effects on families. The myth I mentioned above is a case in point. Substance use disorders occur on a spectrum, with addiction being the most severe form. And the less severe the substance use disorder, the easier it is to treat. So the myth that someone needs to hit rock bottom only prevents people from trying to address the problem when chances of success are much greater. But this myth is only one of many. Frankly, I've got a list of over 30. There are so many cultural myths out there that are at best not helpful and at worst totally counterproductive, like the rock bottom myth. Following on what I mentioned in the previous video in this series, a lot of what we think we know culturally about addiction and substance use disorders comes from what we knew in the first few decades of 12-step recovery. And in the early days of AA, and at least up through the point at which AA's primary text, entitled Alcoholics Anonymous, was written, the program consisted primarily of people who were very, very low bottom cases. In fact, many of the early members worked to expand the fellowship by visiting people whose substance use had landed them in insane asylums. When 12-step family recovery came along, like 15 years later, they were the family members of these very low bottom cases. When AA's primary text was first published in 1939, the text correctly claimed that alcoholism was a disease. But medically, we knew very little about addiction. The American Medical Association didn't declare that addiction was a disease until 1956. AA's primary text, on which all other 12-step fellowships are based, consists of a core text, often referred to as the first 164, which are the first 164 pages of the text, which explain the 12-step process, and then a section of personal stories describing what the person was like, what happened, in other words, how they worked the program, and then what they're like now. And then finally, there's an appendix with articles for wives, families, and employers, and information on spirituality, among other topics. Since its publication in 1939, the only part of Alcoholics Anonymous that has ever been updated is the personal stories. With each edition, some stories get swapped out so that those personal stories reflect as much as possible the diversity of AA's members. But the core text that explains addiction, the first 164 pages, never changes. Now, AA says that it maintains the core text as a way to honor its history and its founders, and this is, of course, AA's prerogative. But the challenge here is that we know so much more about addiction now than we did in 1939 when AA was first founded, or when the text was first published. And while the core text rightly claimed addiction was a disease, it does not keep up with what we have learned in the intervening 84 years about the disease of addiction. But the tenets of addiction and family addiction come from these early days when these fellowships were formed around these very low bottom cases. And just as in the previous episode where I talked about how the slogan, "You can't control it," is only a partial truth, there are also a lot of things that we have learned since those early days that either show there's more to the story or that some things are just plain wrong. The bottom line is we know so much more now, but that new information isn't widely circulating out there. And since a lot of our cultural knowledge comes from the early days of 12-step fellowships, that cultural knowledge has not caught up with what we now know scientifically. And this means that a lot of what we think we know about addiction and family addiction is either only partially correct or completely wrong. We know a lot more today than we used to because culturally our responses to addiction and family addiction have not absorbed this new information, we're not addressing the problem anywhere near as effectively as we could. I'm not saying we now have all the answers. We don't. But we do know way more than we used to. I do what I do because I want to change that. I want to get that updated information circulating widely out there. And that's where the first part of what I do comes in. I'm an educator. We can't hope to effectively address the substance use epidemic if we don't even have accurate information. I want to help families learn the facts. I can't say that there are easy answers. There aren't. And I also can't say that there are guarantees because, again, there aren't. But the decisions family members have to make in the face of a loved one's substance use are hard enough as it is. I'd like to ensure they're at least working with accurate information. So that is reason number 3 why I do what I do. I hope this episode has been helpful. Feel free to drop a comment or send me an email at questions@madeleinecraig.com. Until then, I'll see you in the next episode of Hope for Families TV. Thanks for watching.